A nightmare began with two ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. They were both on what was at the time the most advanced Arctic expedition ever attempted, but they never came back. No confirmed survivors, no clear explanation, just fragments of evidence scattered across the frozen north, and a mystery that would take decades to even begin to understand. Hello, this is Colin from the History Pilgrim. Today I want to take you through a historical story that I think you'll find extremely intriguing. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire stood at the height of its power. It dominated global trade routes, controlled vast territories, and projected naval strength across the planet. But there is still one mystery left unsolved: the Northwest Passage. This was a sea route through the Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. For centuries, explorers searched for it, believing it would shorten trade routes to Asia and bring enormous wealth to whoever discovered it. By the 1800s, many believed it was finally within reach. Naval technology had advanced rapidly, ships were being reinforced with iron plating to resist ice, steam engines were beginning to replace sails, and new scientific instruments allowed far more accurate navigation. It was in this moment of confidence that the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror set sail in 1845, under the command of Sir John Franklin. The mission represented the peak of British ambition in the Arctic. Both ships were not ordinary vessels. They'd originally been built as bomb vessels designed to carry heavy mortars, which made them unusually strong and well suited for Arctic conditions. Before this expedition, they'd already been used in Antarctic exploration, where they proved their durability in extreme environments. For the Northwest Passage mission, they were heavily modified. Their hulls were reinforced with extra layers of timber and iron plating, and inside they were fitted with state-of-the-art heating systems for the time. One of the most important upgrades was the addition of steam engines, allowing the ships to move even without wind. They were also loaded with enormous supplies of food and equipment. This was one of the earliest naval expeditions to rely heavily on tinned food. The ships were essentially floating communities. Officers had cabins with desks and books, crew quarters were relatively spacious, and both vessels carried scientific instruments for mapping, navigation, and observation. In total, over 100 men were divided between the two ships. At the center of the expedition stood Sir John Franklin. By this point, he was already a well-known figure in the Royal Navy, having served during the Napoleonic Wars, and led multiple Arctic expeditions. On one earlier overland journey in northern Canada, Franklin and his crew nearly starved to death. Some of them did not return. By the 1840s, Franklin was in his 60s, an age many considered too old for such a dangerous mission. He had also spent years away from active naval command, including time as colonial administrator of Tasmania. For Franklin, this expedition represented a return to exploration, and possibly the final chance to secure his legacy. When the expedition left England, it did so with pride and optimism. Crowds gathered to watch the ships depart, and few imagined they would ever see them again. The journey began normally. The ships crossed the North Atlantic and reached Baffin Bay, where they were last seen in the summer of 1845 by European whalers. Fully intact, they continued westward into the Arctic ice, and then disappeared from contact with the outside world. What happened next is only known through fragments of evidence discovered years later. The Arctic does not become dangerous all at once. It changes slowly. In summer, the ice opens just enough to allow passage, but as seasons shift, those channels close again. Ships can become trapped without warning. This is likely what happened to the Erebus and Terror. By 1846, they entered the maze of ice near King William's Island in what is now northern Canada. At some point, they became frozen in place. At first, it may not have seemed catastrophic. They had supply, shelter, and hope, but over time the situation changed. The Arctic winter brought months of darkness and extreme cold. Temperatures dropped to levels that made survival increasingly difficult. Food supplies began to run low, morale collapsed, and the frozen landscape offered no path forward. According to records later recovered, the ships were eventually abandoned, after nearly 2 years stuck in ice. By then, Sir John Franklin had died, and command passed to his officers. Leaving the ships must have been a terrifying decision. They had been their protection, their shelter, and their world, but staying was no longer possible. Their plan, as far as it can be understood, was to travel south towards the Back River on the Canadian mainland, where they hoped to find food or reach a trading post. They set out dragging heavy sleds loaded with supplies, boats, and equipment. The Arctic wind was relentless, and every step forward required enormous effort. Inuit oral histories recorded years later describe groups of exhausted men moving across the ice, thin, weak, and struggling to live. This suggests that the crew may have split into smaller groups as conditions worsened. Over time, scattered campsites and remains were discovered across the region. The fate of the expedition remains one of the greatest mysteries in exploration history. Evidence found in the late 1800s included human remains with cut marks, suggesting cannibalism may have occurred in the final stages of survival. More recent discoveries have added clarity. The wrecks of both ships were found in 2014 and 2016, remarkably well preserved, especially the Terror. This suggests that at least one ship may have remained in use for some time after abandonment. While much of the story remains uncertain, recovered documents, most famously the Victory Point record, provide brief fragmented insight into the crew's final days. One widely discussed theory suggests lead poisoning may have contributed to their decline, as lead from the tinned food may have caused neurological symptoms such as confusion and poor decision-making. In the end, the story of the Erebus and Terror is not just the story of a failed expedition. It is the story about the limits of human confidence, a mission carefully planned, backed by the full strength of the British Navy, slowly undone by an environment that does not negotiate, does not soften, and does not forgive. What began as one of the most ambitious explorations of all time ended in isolation, uncertainty, and disappearance, leaving behind only fragments and a mystery that still has not been fully answered. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to stay tuned for more history videos. Sincerely, the History Pilgrim.